today to invoke this statement from President Kimball from 50 years ago. And I am particularly interested, as you can see here, in how that manifests in one particular kind of reading experience. So at the opening of the school year at BYU, as Michael has already indicated, September 1967, then Elder Spencer W. Kimball addressed the faculty in a speech called Education for Eternity. At the time, Elder Kimball had been an apostle. So if you didn't actually believe that, you might be the heroine of a YA dystopian novel, and you'll be responsible for saving all of our lives. So Elder Kimball was called as an apostle in 1943 at the age of 48. And he proposed this sweeping vision, not just for the church-owned university, but for the Mormon people as a whole. He had had a vision, he said, of BYU faculty members, students, and alumni not only contributing to worldly knowledge and artistic success, but dominating in those fields until the eyes of all the world will be upon us. He said that in our world there have risen brilliant stars in drama, music, literature, sculpture, painting, science, and all the graces. For long years I have had a vision of the BYU, greatly increasing its already strong position of excellence, again, till the eyes of all the world will be upon us. He then quoted a September 1857 sermon by John Taylor, in which Taylor prophesied of greatness for the Mormon people. He said, "You will see the day that Zion will be far ahead of the outside world in everything pertaining to learning of every kind, as we are today in regard to religious matters. God expects Zion to become the praise and glory of the whole earth, so that kings, hearing of her fame, will come and gaze upon her glory." So no pressure, Mormon artists sitting in this room. This is a bold and I think a fascinating vision. Both leaders at the time in which they spoke had yet to become church presidents, but both of them spoke prophetically of a future day in which Mormon artists, writers, and musicians would dominate in their respective spheres. This probably seemed a pipe dream in 1857 when John Taylor spoke. In that year, Mormonism experienced a net loss of more than 8,000 members, which for a church at that time of barely 55,000 people represented more than a 13% decline. Mormonism was also embattled on every side, fighting the federal government on the one side, and some of its own members even, within the context of the Mormon Reformation. In fact, Taylor's sunny vision of the LDS Church becoming the praise and glory of the whole earth came just 9 days after the Mountain Meadows Massacre. This was a strange time indeed to imagine Mormonism blessing the world. Things were looking up, though, 110 years later, when Spencer W. Kimball was thinking along these same lines. In 1967, Mormonism had just surpassed 2.6 million members and was growing at a rate of 5% a year. New lands seemed to be opening constantly for the preaching of the gospel. 50 years after President Kimball's bold mandate, we are yet without those clearly defined Shakespeare's and Michelangelo's. There is no single individual that we can point to in an artistic field and say that one Mormon has achieved artistic domination in that field of endeavor. Just so we can better understand the context of what President Kimball was communicating, here's a list of all of the individuals that he singled out from history as masters of art, music, science, and literature. As Michael has already pointed out, there are a couple of issues with this list. More than 24 people. They're all from Europe or North America, unless you consider Russia to be Asian. Maybe in a pinch you could count it, but I don't quite think so. There's no one on this list from Africa, East Asia, South America, or Oceania. President Kimball envisioned the whole world praising the rich cultural capital of the Latter-day Saints, yet it was a very particular kind of culture that he was praising. And has also been mentioned already, women are almost entirely absent from this list. Of the 4 he mentioned, 3 are singers, and only one, Marie Curie, could be considered an innovator or creator. Women in this list are essentially either absent, or they are interpreters and muses for the creative works written by men. I am not pointing this out to criticize President Kimball or his vision. Even in that more narrow context of this male Western vision of what art is, we still haven't managed to do it, right? Even within that context, we haven't produced a single creative genius who bucks tradition enough to make the world stand up and take notice. So maybe it's time to examine that paradigm and think about what we want. I think part of the problem is that we are honoring and valuing the wrong things, the things that Mormons don't do as well. Many of the names on President Kimball's list are individuals who would fall into this lone genius archetype. Iconoclasts who break the artistic or scientific conventions of their time to bring a field forward into new directions. These people were not always popular, and in some cases their moral behavior was not what leaders of the LDS Church might wish its members to emulate, perhaps resulting in President Kimball's kind of funny and cautious statement that any future Mormon Wagner should be less eccentric, more spiritual. So Mormons haven't had great luck with the lone genius paradigm. I think lone genius is just not our jam. In music, we excel here at choral singing. We saw this even with Steve's reading this morning. I mean, really? In Vietnam, in prison, she organizes a choir of rats. So Mormon. The Mormon Tabernacle Choir is one of the best and most cohesive choral groups in the nation, and perhaps even the world. In television, we have seen Mormons have an unusually robust presence in reality TV, particularly in contests and shows where teamwork is involved, like the rigor and classical beauty of ballroom dancing. And in writing, we excel in genre fiction. So, what is genre fiction? I want to say that this debate between literary fiction and genre fiction is as old as the hills and possibly an outdated question. But if it's helpful, here are some characteristics of each. The best writers are the ones who can field between these categories in a really beautiful way, making keen observations about human nature while also considering genre expectations. So literary fiction typically involves more artistic risk and fewer conventions. This is fiction that pushes artistic boundaries. We saw an example of that with Steve's novel today. And I would say that in Mormonism, we have very few examples of novelists who are writing literary fiction and are still active in the church. We have Steve, and we have Steve, and that's kind of it. Literary fiction is not tied to a particular reading community other than the author's own circle of fans. One Zadie Smith novel is not like another Zadie Smith novel. Earlier this year, I read George Saunders' book, Lincoln in the Bardo, which was, I think, the best book I will read all year. But I'm pretty sure that the next George Saunders book will be entirely different and amazing, but totally different. This is what is considered to be serious literature. Literary novels are the ones that are considered for literary acclaim, awards like the Man Booker Prize or the National Book Award. And finally, literary fiction seeks to better understand the human condition. This is fiction that endeavors to think about the key questions about what it means to be a human being in relationship with others. Genre fiction falls into some main categories that you recognize: science fiction, mystery, romance, fantasy, horror, and even within those categories there are often multiple subgenres, so that you would have a Regency romance category of historical romances that are set in the early 19th century, versus erotica, which is something totally different that we will not discuss today. There's the cozy mystery in the mystery genre. There's also the legal thriller, and readers of each of those communities come to those books with separate expectations. Genre fiction is written for a popular and clearly defined audience. Those expectations are very clear. A reader who wants a cozy kitchen mystery is going to be appalled by graphic violence that might characterize other genres of darker mystery fiction. And someone who reads bonnet fiction, which is primarily set in Amish communities, wants sex to happen only from the neck up. Thank you very much. There's kissing in the barn, and that's it. That's all that you can expect. But writers who disregard the conventions and the expectations of readers do so at their peril. Genre fiction is intended as entertainment. It quite wonderfully and unabashedly presents itself as a good time. It's not intending to drag us through the dark night of the soul. We read genre fiction mostly to escape from reality, and we read literary fiction to try to understand reality better. Genre fiction is often not taken seriously by critics, which is unfortunate in many cases. Some of the, I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy, and some of the best books in those fields could have wonderful literary merit, like Mary Doria Russell's novel The Sparrow, if you're familiar with that. It is set in outer space. It's a Jesuit missionary who goes to outer space in order to colonize a new planet. Beautiful and heart-wrenching, but it does succeed in fulfilling the genre expectations of most science fiction readers. More recently, the novel Station 11 is one that I would point to as having a dystopian setting, but taking it so far beyond that genre that it is like your first meal in Italy after you've only ever eaten at the Olive Garden. Just to make it clear, in case that was a snobbish comment, I read a lot of this fiction, and I thoroughly enjoy genre fiction. Some of it I read for review, but some of it I just read for pleasure. So I'm speaking from the vantage point primarily as a fan, and not as a critic. Genre fiction is where we see Mormon authors shine. Here we have Shannon Hale, Brandon Mull, who are both writing in the YA market, and then someone named Jeff Benedict, who I have not heard of, who is a nonfiction writer. People have tried to explain why there are so many Mormons who are successful in the YA market, particularly in the genres of science fiction and fantasy. One of the ones that I have found least convincing is the outlandish theology paradigm in which Mormons gravitate toward writing science fiction because our beliefs are already so outrageous that it's not a stretch. I don't find this particularly compelling. I will talk at the end briefly about the way that Mormon writers' fiction does often reflect Mormon themes. So I'm not saying that our theology is irrelevant here, but to dismiss these writers' success as merely the result of an unusual openness to very speculative ideas is facile at best and insulting at worst. Mormon theology may indeed be mind-bending, but I don't find that an adequate explanation for the outsized presence of Mormon authors in these genres. I do want to propose another idea. Community is our Shakespeare. This is a far more compelling argument than I really thought that I had come up with myself. In March, when I was speaking about this coming conference to Rosalind Welch, I mentioned this basic thesis that I wanted to present here, that Mormon authors have gravitated toward genre fiction because of community, and the way that Mormons are uniquely able to build community. And then I found out that Rosalind, who is a literary scholar, had also presented a similar thesis at a conference about a decade ago. But here's the thing, and I think this illustrates the thesis itself. Rosalind sent me all of her work and encouraged me to use it, to build upon it, and to collaborate, essentially, which I think is the essence of Mormon community right there. She made my paper better by talking about it with me a couple of times. Here, Rosalind observes that in the case of Mormon culture, Mormon artists have not devised new, unique artistic forms from their ethnic religious milieu. Instead, they've borrowed from the genres and media circulating in their particular social contexts. Mormon culture values the superior performance of shared forms over the originality of invention. I think she's on to something here. She goes on to say, for the Mormon writer, it is precisely the accessibility of the genres that makes them successful cultural figures for an affirmative performance. Genres are of the people and for the people, whereas literary fiction can be legitimately intended, possibly even for an audience of one, the author herself. What works so well for Mormon genre novelists is that they are steeped in community already, and fulfillment of community expectations is vital for success in genre fiction. A couple of things here. First, there's that contract with the reader, the expectations I spoke about. Readers in genres come to the book primed for a certain kind of experience. In an adventure novel, you need to have a heroic protagonist who has a transformative, quest-like adventure, and on and on. Authors who conform to those expectations with style and love will be rewarded with loyal and enthusiastic readers. Authors who do not conform to those expectations will have a harder time building a following, although there are some exceptions. Secondly, successful authors in genre fiction realize also, now more than ever in the age of social media, that the community they are building and reinforcing with readers does not begin and end with the reading experience itself. This is another area where Mormon writers shine. I can't really think of any top LDS genre novelists who don't make themselves accessible to their readers through travel, book fairs, Twitter posts, Comic-Con experiences, and other means. Just this week, Kirsten White, who has a new novel coming out, which is a sequel to her very interesting feminist proto-origin story of Dracula. But that's not all she posts about on social media. She's always talking about her life, politics, children, and perhaps most importantly, the tremendous support she expresses for other writers. She is constantly pointing her own fans to them. The New York Times has offered this explanation from Mark Oppenheimer, that Mormon sexual ethics are the reason why Mormon writers have gravitated toward YA fiction. And as you can see from this quote here, it's because non-marital sex has become normative in adult fiction elsewhere that this is apparently supposed to be the only last stand for Mormon writers. The Salt Lake Tribune summed up this article by saying that the authors must then be all prudish Mormons, afraid to grow up and write real books for serious adults. It was a pretty insulting New York Times article. While there is perhaps some truth to that explanation, I would like to augment it with something that is not quite so negative. and more focused on the ways that Mormonism can and does bless the world. We are simply a very child-friendly subculture. We have more children than the national average, and while that figure is declining in the younger generations, right now we're still looking at an average of Mormons having 4.02 children, which is very high. So my Exhibit A for Mormons who are very intentional about writing for young people, young adults, is Shannon Hale, who's a terrific writer, and also a mother of 4. And she says, having kids while writing for kids is a constant and valuable reminder of what really matters. Spoiler, it's not me. I think that is a succinctly and perhaps very Mormon expression of why some of our writers make art. We are looking often to inspire, to educate, to uplift. Right now, this week, there is a conference in Utah that some of these young adult fiction writers in Utah, Mormon mostly, but not all, have organized for high school students. In the context of learning how to write, they're also going to be attending the Utah Shakespeare Festival. They're going to be playing something called pickleball, which I've never heard of. It doesn't sound very fun, but I'm sure it's really fun. The point of events like this is not simply to teach young people how to write, but to create community. And this is not everywhere in genre fiction, this kind of supportive, youth-focused environment. Quickly want to point to this man, Rick Walton, who recently passed away, but was a very prominent picture book author, and also was responsible for gathering many of these writers who have become best-selling authors in their respective genres. By all accounts, he had a singular gift, not only for writing children's books, but also for encouraging other writers with advice and introductions. So some of those authors and their work is presented here. The group that they have founded is called Rock Canyon, and the Rock Canyon writers meet regularly. They have regular discussions online. They have an annual conference. And when I interviewed Meddy Harrison about her involvement with this group, she said, "We don't see one another as competition. We see projects as community projects rather than solo projects." Finally, I do want to point to one confluence that has increased the visibility and success of Mormon writers in this particular historical moment, and it's the rise of dystopian fiction. It's possible that Mormon authors have been especially successful in this one particular subgenre. This would also be the same subgenre of James Dashner's Maze Runner books, dystopian or post-apocalyptic. I think that many of these books are about the essential nature of agency and human free will. Some of them are pointing to societies in which individual choice has been removed, obedience is enforced, sometimes with very pleasant results, sometimes not. And there may be a sense in which Mormons are more theologically equipped to see both the blessings and the dangers of obedience and this kind of perfection that is encouraged as a society. Mormons do believe in a God who was willing to sacrifice fully 1/3 of the host of humanity in order to preserve the human ability to choose. And so it's a theme that keeps coming up in many of these novels by Mormon writers, not just in the Matched trilogy that I pointed to, but also in Stephanie Meyer's adult novel, The Host, which is very much about agency, strongly emphasized. In conclusion, Mormons have been told that we should, and we will, have our Shakespeares. But what if we've been thinking about that too narrowly? As Meddy told me, we already do have some of our Shakespeares, if that means we have writers who will be profoundly influential to other writers. The lone genius archetype is one way of defining success, but another may be in building community with readers and fellow creatives, and in that, Mormons excel. Thank you.